It is my honor to introduce our esteemed speaker. Steve Kornacki is the preeminent American political reporter, breaking down the voting trends, results, and demographics of each district, county, and municipality across the nation. Previously, he reported on Congress for the newspaper Roll Call and wrote for Salon.com. He's been published in the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, and the New York Times, among others. And as you all know, he just authored a great book, The Red and the Blue, the 1990s and the Birth of Political Tribalism. I have been asked to remind you that it makes a great gift for the holidays. What's more impressive about Steve Kornacki is that he started his journalism career as a political reporter right here in New Jersey. And as Dr. Dworkin often tells us in class, when it comes to politics, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. Moving to MSNBC in 2013, Steve Kornacki hosted a variety of shows, and last year was named National Political Correspondent for NBC News. On a more personal note, for people like me, someone who nerds out on politics, Steve Kornacki is a rock star. Few people know more about our country's electorate than he does. And as I crunched numbers in my senior research methods class, I look to people like Steve Kornacki for inspiration. He joins us tonight on the subject of what exactly happened in the 2018 midterm elections. We are all about to become a whole lot smarter. Ladies and gentlemen of the Rowan community, please join me in welcoming our featured guest, Steve Kornacki.
All right. Thank you. That was a great introduction. A lot of pressure. I don't know how smarter anybody's going to get here, but thank you. That's a great introduction. You didn't have to do the book plug, but I'm really glad you did. The publisher will thank you for that one too. But yeah, no, thank you, Ben. Thank you, everybody here at Rowan for welcoming me. And yes, I've been in political journalism for a little bit more than 15 years right now. But I did get my start in New Jersey. I remember it still, 2002. It was Labor Day weekend, 2002, and I got an interview with Bob Torricelli, the Torch. Oh, people remember the Torch. And he had just been reprimanded. He was running for re-election. The Senate Ethics Committee had reprimanded him. It was the most closely watched race in the country. And I got here, I'm about 22 years old, and I'm told I've got the first one-on-one interview with Bob Torricelli since this Ethics Committee reprimand. Kind of a big deal. And I'm thinking to myself, this journalism thing's pretty easy, I guess. These interviews just fall in your lap. And I got into the car with him for the interview, asked him one question, kind of just something off the top of my head. He wheeled around, challenged the validity of the question, had quite a few pieces of information at his disposal, and I just stepped back, intimidated as hell, questioning every life decision I'd made, wondering if I was up for this, and realizing the reason I'd got the interview was they figured he could walk all over me, which he pretty much did at the start of that interview. So that was my introduction to politics. But I think I learned quickly. I think I got better. New Jersey was a great place to learn about politics for all sorts of different reasons. Ended up spending a little bit more than 3 years, I guess it was, covering politics here. The 3 funnest years that I've spent in political journalism, without question. The culture, the characters, the bizarre plot twists. It was great. So it's always enjoy coming back to New Jersey. But and we can certainly talk plenty of Jersey a little bit later on, and I'll try to work it into this a little bit. But yeah, idea here, this talk tonight, and I'm anxious to get to the Q&A too. I always love just hearing what's on your mind and talking a little bit with you folks. But it was a 2018 midterm, and what did we learn from it? What happened? Why did it happen? What does it tell us about what might happen in 2020. I think that's the question that ends up being on everybody's mind. Is this a harbinger of something, or is this a one-off? Is this an outlier? I think the first thing I'd say before I start, getting a little more detailed here with the numbers and with the maps is, it feels to me that the way midterm elections have evolved, the way politics has sort of evolved in this country, midterm elections are almost perfectly designed, and it's maybe by an accident, but they're almost perfectly designed to reveal the weaknesses of a political coalition, the limits of a political coalition. We seem to have this pattern that's established itself, especially over the last generation or so, but it goes back farther than that, where a president will come in with a head of steam, will come in with majorities in the House, majorities in the Senate, majorities on Capitol Hill. We saw Barack Obama certainly do that, in about 10 years ago. We saw Bill Clinton do that in the 90s. We saw George W. Bush come in, not necessarily with a head of steam in terms of, the disputed election of 2000, but he came in there, with a Republican majority in the House and Senate when he first started out. And you saw Donald Trump come in, obviously a controversial but surprise victory for him in 2016, and he came in with big Republican majorities. Trump now the third of the last four presidents to watch that majority vanish in his first midterm election. So there's a bit of a pattern there. The two before him, Clinton in the 90s, Obama more recently, both bounced back and won re-election. So when I say midterms are kind of designed to reveal the limits of a coalition, that's what we've seen recently. You sort of get the presidential election is sort of the high water mark, and then there's a fall off. And you sort of see, okay, that coalition that elected the president, what are the weakest groups? Where is the loyalty the weakest? Who are the voters who are most likely to defect to the other side, who are most likely just not to show up the next time around? That's, I think, one of the things that we learn from midterm elections. Then it raises the question of, how lost are those voters for the president, for the president's party? Are they voters the president can win back 2 years later, or has something else happened here that has sort of severed those voters and will complicate the president's reelection prospects? So that's sort of what I'm trying to get at here, looking at this election. A couple things about this midterm. Some of them make me think that we basically have almost a cementing of what was put in place in 2016, the divisions that we saw in the 2016 elections. There is some of that I'm seeing in these results, and it is making me sort of feel that if you once you get a Democratic opponent for Donald Trump with a name and a reputation and a target for Trump in 2020, and if you do have Trump running again as the Republican candidate, that a lot of those divisions we saw in the 2016 map will just come back. There are some things in the midterm results that make me suspect that. There are also some elements of the midterm results that make me wonder if there are a few things that have changed in a more substantial way that could make 2020 a little different. So here's what I mean. First of all, let's see if this will work. There we go. Okay, first of all, just look at this. This is pending right now. These are just the total number of votes that were cast in this midterm election. That number is still going to go up. They are still counting votes in California. They are still counting votes in some other places. We may end up, 114, 115 million votes cast in a midterm election. The most recent midterm election you see on this screen, besides 2018, is 2014. Look at that. Almost 40 million fewer votes were cast in the last midterm election than this year. How about 2010? 2010, remember, that was a lot of energy in 2010. That was the Tea Party rebellion. Republican enthusiasm was through the roof. Obama had just been elected 2 years earlier. In 2010, basically, 30 million fewer votes cast in the midterm election. This is off the charts in modern times. Certainly in my lifetime, in my career, we've had high-stakes midterm elections. We've had midterm elections where you've seen what you thought looked like a lot of energy, at least on one side. Nothing like this. In the 2012 presidential election, right now the turnout total for this midterm is within 10 million of the 2012 presidential election. You go back a little further in time, you're at presidential level turnout. So that's something we saw certainly in 2016 the energy level there, was high in the 2016 election. I think just the big picture, the most fascinating thing to me has been that the 2016 election, it marked an acceleration point. This is the first time we've seen there's no let-up. Usually there's some let-up between the presidential election and the midterm. It just really has been no let-up the last 2 years. People have gotten more energized. We see all sorts of evidence of this, not just in voting, just in people's engagement with politics in so many different ways, in terms of activism, in terms of donations, honestly, in terms of cable news audience. You see a lot of evidence of it. So that is just an amazing level of engagement. My question is, how high will that go in 2020 when you actually have a presidential race at the top of the ballot again? How high are we looking at? Okay, so here we go. This is the bottom line, and I can actually give you a piece of news. What you have here, this is your flip chart. This is the House of Representatives. The Democrats got control of the House. Everything in blue that you see right there, that is a seat that the Democrats flipped. So those are all okay. We got a couple Democrats here. Or just really self-loathing Republicans. I'm not sure how to understand that. So you've got the Democratic flips right there. The one that has no color right there, actually, California 21, you see, literally on my way over here tonight, the NBC News decision desk called that race for the Democrat. So that what that adds up to right now, that is a 40-seat net gain for the Democrats. There were a couple. You can see 2 in Minnesota, 1 in Pennsylvania. Remember, they redrew the map in Pennsylvania in the middle of the year. The numbers all changed. That pickup for Republicans is almost like an accounting trick there with that new map. The 2 in Minnesota are a little bit more interesting, but you balance out those 3 Republican pickups with what the Democrats got. That is a net gain of 40 seats for the Democrats. It's the biggest gain Democrats have posted in one of these midterm elections since the Watergate midterm of 1974. I'd also add there is a chance that could go to 41. I've been following this closely. There's this congressional district in North Carolina, Republican held, was called by NBC, by every other outlet. For the Republican, the margin is 905 votes right now. There are now all sorts of suspicions about absentee ballots. Were they actually cast by the people in whose name they were taken out? Were they cast at all? I covered a story like this in Atlantic City when I was in New Jersey, so it has happened before. I can remember it. And there's the possibility there that there may be a new election there. There's the state board that's overseeing that is having hearings over the next few weeks. They could decide to invalidate the election. They could decide to have a new one. And if the Democrat were to win that would then be a net gain of 41 for Democrats. And then I think finally, probably sometime around February 2019, we would actually be through with the 2018 election. So this one has gone on and on and on. But see, the Democrats, it's a huge number for the Democrats by any historical comparison to get 40 or maybe even possibly 41. What I find so interesting about it, though, is where did it come from? And in particular, here's the heart of it. What you see here, and again, the same thing. If it's blue, it's a Democratic pickup. If it's a red, this is not a Republican pickup. It's just a Democratic miss. This was the number one this was the first line of attack for Democrats when it came to the House in the midterm election. These were districts. There are 25 of them going into this election that were held by Republicans, but in 2016 had voted against Donald Trump. So in the presidential election in 2016, in every single one of the districts you see right here, Hillary Clinton carried the district, but those same voters in that district said, we're going to send a Republican to Congress. That happened in 2016. There were 25 of them. Look at the wipeout. 22 of those 25, 88% of those Clinton Republican districts are now lost for the Republicans. There are going to be 3 Republicans in the next Congress, 3 Republicans representing districts that Hillary Clinton carried in 2016. Just a total wipeout. And those were, by and large, close races, too, in those 3 red ones you see there. I mean, that could have been 25 for 25 for the Democrats. Why I think this is so significant is a couple things. Number one, a lot of these seats are, what we talk about all the time, suburban. Talk about this new divide. It's a divide that's been growing for a long time in American politics, but it has really accelerated in the Trump era. It's the suburbs we talk about this divide among white voters, the college-educated white voters versus non-college white voters, which tends to be, this is not, we don't make this distinction to say one's intelligent, one's not intelligent, it's nothing like that. But it does get to, it's about social class, about where people live, income, this sort of thing. And when you start looking in these areas, it tend to be metropolitan areas, white-collar professional, commuter class, that sort of thing. These are the areas that were traditionally Republican. You can go back generations, traditionally Republican. There's been movement for the last generation or so away from the Republicans towards the Democrats in these areas, often for cultural reasons, social issues, that sort of thing. It has just accelerated like crazy since Donald Trump became president. And I think it's very significant because what you had here, you had voters in these areas, these suburban areas, these metro areas, who even in 2016 were willing to say, were ready to say, I don't like Donald Trump. I don't want Donald Trump to be president, but I'm not giving up on the Republican Party. I'm still going to vote for my local Republican for Congress. I'm still going to vote Republican down the rest of the ballot. I'm just not going to vote for Trump. Now, what this is telling me is 2 years into the Trump presidency, that is trickling down, and those voters are saying, I'm not voting for the Republican Party anymore. And that's what you see down ballot gains for Democrats in all sorts of races. You start looking at state legislative seats around the country, local races, local partisan races around the country. This is sort of ground zero for where the Democrats did their damage on Election Day. Again, say a 40-seat net gain right now, more than half of them just come from these Clinton districts. I mean, I just look at some of those places you see on there. You see Kansas 03. So, Kansas, where the Republicans lost a seat in Kansas. This is right outside Kansas City. It's called Johnson County, Kansas. It's quintessential bedroom communities. About 1/4 of the population, really, of almost about 20%, I should say, of Kansas' population is here in this area, Johnson County, in that area. Classically, culturally moderate area. Voters who care about their local, they want their local schools to be well funded. They want their kids going off to college. They've had some concerns with the local Republican Party in Kansas, but they're also generally more conservative on fiscal issues. Look at that. They flipped. They elected a Democrat to Congress from the suburbs of Kansas City. Minnesota 3, that is the suburbs of, that's the Twin Cities suburbs. Texas 7. How about Texas 7? You see that on your list right there. It's West Houston, western and suburb. It's really West Houston, a bit of a suburban area there. So that district, 52 years ago, that district for the very first time, remember the South used to be uniformly Democratic, conservative Democratic, but it used to be uniformly Democratic. The big breakthrough for the modern Republican Party in the Houston area was 52 years ago in 1966. For that House seat, what is now the 7th District of Texas. The seat was won by a man named George H.W. Bush, the first ever Republican to represent Houston in Congress. He won that seat in 1966. He gave it up in 1970. He was replaced by another Republican. His name was Bill Archer. Bill Archer then held that seat for 3 decades. Archer gave it up in 2000. He was replaced by another Republican. His name is John Culberson. He held the seat all the way through until a month ago. And in November of 2018, I think that's a very significant moment when you take that history into account. And that's the story of Texas 7. That's a story we see elsewhere in the country. You had somebody who fit George H.W. Bush's profile. That was the type of Republican who voters in a place like Texas 7, a metro area, a suburb, were comfortable with. And that was what they associated the Republican Party with. And as the Republican Party in that area, in particular, has become less the party of George H.W. Bush-style Republicanism, George H.W. Bush-style conservatism, however you want to define that, and more the party now of Donald Trump-style conservatism. You see those voters going away. Half a century of Republican dominance has melted away in that district in Texas. And again, you're just seeing it in these, Virginia 10 is right outside the Washington suburbs, Illinois 6, this is, the Chicagoland area, on and on. So again, it's metropolitan areas, suburbs, voters who were against Donald Trump in 2016, taking it out on the entire Republican Party. The other thing that's interesting about this, though, is I think there was a bit of growth for Democrats, too. Here's one of the things, one of the places I see it. This is the 6th District of Georgia. This is a Democratic pickup. You see a very narrow margin there, 1 point. If you follow politics closely, the name Karen Handel, you may remember there was a special election in this district in 2017. Tom Price, remember, left his House seat to join the Trump administration. That didn't last too long, but he left his House seat. They had a special election. Democrats got behind this guy named John Ossoff. He's a young guy, didn't even live in the district. They raised like $30 million for him. They thought they were going to flip it. They didn't flip it. Karen Handel won that special election, runs for a full term this year, and gets defeated and loses. Now, here's a district, you're talking about the long-term shift of the suburbs away from the Republican Party. Here's a district where this is not a long-term story. Here's a district where if you go back to the 2012 presidential election, Mitt Romney versus Barack Obama, Mitt Romney carried this district by 23 points. This was a landslide district. So in this part of the country, in the Northeast, sort of in the Chicago area, the Midwest, along the Pacific coast, there's been a longer-term story here, I think, of the suburbs moving away from the Republican Party. In the South, in the Sun Belt, kind of broadly defined here, this is a more recent phenomenon. It's more Trump-specific. And I think that's 2016, Tom Price didn't have, his opponent may not have even existed. There was this whole thing, they couldn't track down the guy. Tom Price had no problem winning re-election, but Trump struggled in this district. 2018, it got even worse. Trump did carry this district in 2016. It was close, but he carried it. In 2018, Republican who'd won a special election, who stood up to $30 million in Democratic money, was unable to hang on to the seat. I think there's growth for Democrats potentially in the Sun Belt, and the implications that potentially has for 2020. Obviously, state like Georgia, that we customarily think of as a Republican state, as a red state, as not a battleground state in a presidential election. Still, clearly, you would call it a red state right now. It is going to have another Republican governor. Brian Kemp won the gubernatorial race in Georgia, but that was a close race. Well, officially, you're looking at he's barely over 50% right there. It's as close as Democrats have come basically in 2 decades in Georgia. And it's in this part of Georgia. If you can see where the yellow outline is here, this is right outside Atlanta. This takes in a little bit of some of Fulton County, Cobb County. That's where the Democratic strength, that's where the population is rising, and Democratic strength is surging. And I think in 2020, this is one early on, I think people are going to be thinking of Georgia as a swing state potentially in 2020, when Republicans have some advantages, but Democrats, I think, are going to take much more of a shot at Georgia in 2020, at least at the beginning, than we've seen before. So I think that's one of the changes potentially that the 2018 midterm is suggesting to me. Texas as well. Talking about this Sun Belt suburban strength the Democrats had. This I thought was I'm singling this one out because Pete Sessions. This is sort of suburban Dallas you're looking at right here. Pete Sessions, the Republican incumbent, was defeated here, ends up being handily defeated. It's a similar story here. This is a district that Republicans were not having trouble with a couple years ago. They are having trouble with it in the age of Trump. And Pete Sessions one of his jobs used to be, he was the chairman of the NRCC, the National Republican Congressional. He ran the Congressional Committee for Republican candidates around the country. And he said at the start of this election, don't worry about me. I know this map. I'm not going to need any money. I'm not going to need any money from the national party. By the end, he needed it. And it still wasn't enough. So again, I think there's Texas. I say Georgia as a swing state potentially in 2020. I'm not convinced Texas is going to be there, but I think you saw something similar in Texas that you saw in Georgia, where the strength for Democrats, in terms of the energy, in terms of the turnout, in terms of the margins, it was very concentrated in these metro areas. Right outside Dallas, so strong that a guy like Pete Sessions loses right outside of Dallas. Right outside of Houston, so strong that Bush's old district goes Democratic. Obviously, Austin, we've always known that to be a Democratic bastion, but again, huge energy right there. That alone takes a state. Look, Beto O'Rourke lost that race by about 3 points. Think about it. In 2012, Mitt Romney carried Texas over Obama by 16. In 2016, Trump struggled a little relative to how Republicans normally do. He won it by 9. In 2018, with all of that energy, Democrats knocked that margin in the Senate race in Texas down to 3 points, picked off some House seats around there. Again, Texas is a tall order for Democrats. It's one they've been talking about for a while. But I do think you have the makings of a formula here for Democrats to compete in a way they haven't in the South before. I think that's the fairest way to put it, where if you can drive up that kind of energy, your growth area, if you're a Democrat, is the suburbs. You've known that in the North. I think you're starting to see that more in the South right now. And I think it has the potential to make some of these states in the South and the Sun Belt that we've traditionally thought of as Republican states more competitive. And the third one I would just add, when I say Sun Belt, say Georgia, Texas. The other one I think clearly is on the swing state list now for 2020 would be Arizona. And again, it's the same story. It's the same types of voters right outside of Phoenix, the Phoenix metro area. You saw Kyrsten Sinema, the Democrat, winning that race over Republicans. The Senate race in Arizona, Republicans dreamed of getting Martha McSally as their candidate. They got her into the race. They said, okay, we got the right candidate. We can win this race right now. They didn't. Kyrsten Sinema, and in Sinema also there was, they always talk about opposition research in politics. Boy, there was a lot of opposition research that dropped on Kyrsten Sinema in that campaign. Speeches she gave, I don't think she was expecting necessarily to be a Senate nominee in 2018 a few years ago, because she made a bunch of comments, a bunch of sort of offhanded comments about Arizona that were caught on tape about 5, 6, 7 years ago. Those came out in October. Republicans thought, well, we got her now. They didn't. She won anyway. And it told me that there was, my read on that was the types of voters we're describing, these sort of suburban, metro area voters, are so strongly committed right now to voting against the Republicans, against Trump's party, and for the Democrats, that it's going to override a lot of things that normally have mattered in campaigns. I'm in New Jersey. We've got the perfect example of it here in New Jersey. Bob Menendez got reelected. Easily. I said Torricelli at the beginning of this. Bob Menendez was facing almost a carbon copy of what Bob Torricelli was facing in 2002. Bob, the donor, did he get gifts? Did he get cash? Did he get favors in exchange for performing official acts on behalf of the donor? That was the charge against Torricelli. The feds investigated him. They didn't prosecute him. They referred it to the Senate Ethics Committee. He was severely admonished. Menendez was prosecuted. He got a hung jury. It was referred to the Senate Ethics Committee. He was severely admonished. The letter looked almost identical. It came out election year. In 2002, Bob Torricelli fell double digits behind. 5 weeks before Election Day, was forced to drop out of the race. Democrats brought in Frank Lautenberg, won the seat. In 2018, Bob Menendez said, I'll stay in the race, and won, basically by 10 points. That is, I believe, we talk about the idea of voters overlooking things now that we've been taught to believe matter in campaigns because they are on one side or the other in this much bigger partisan, almost tribal conflict, this red versus blue conflict. I've given you Arizona, and I realize I'm in New Jersey. New Jersey is the classic example of it here for 2018. Now let me show you the flip side, though. I've shown you Democrats' huge number in the House, particular strength in suburban areas, watching that strength extend to the Sun Belt, potentially putting in play states in the Sun Belt in 2020 that haven't been in play in the past. I think those are some of the things Democrats can take from this midterm and feel very encouraged about. Is there a flip side? What could Republicans be encouraged about? What could Democrats be worried about coming out of this election? I think this is where I would start when you want to look at that. Florida, right? As always. So here it is, DeSantis and Gillum, the governor's race. You see DeSantis winning that thing, about 30,000 votes. A couple things stick out about this race to me. Number one, in primary season, as the parties were picking their candidates for major races around the country, we were seeing consistently around the country incredible energy on the Democratic side. Just turnout in Democratic primaries for all sorts of offices around the country, different states, different regions. Turnout, we were just consistently seeing was astronomical. You were seeing record shattered, that sort of thing. You saw that in Florida, in the Democratic primary in Florida. Andrew Gillum, who was the mayor of Tallahassee, he energized a very energized Democratic base and won a big upset victory in the Democratic primary. And there's this recipe, this traditional recipe Democrats have had in Florida, which is sort of obviously a classic swing state, a state that maybe, if it tilts anywhere, it tilts a little bit to the Republicans. And traditionally, Democrats have acknowledged that in their strategy for statewide elections in Florida. And they've looked for a candidate who they think of where the center of the electorate must be in a state like Florida. And they've looked for a candidate who they think can speak to that center. A candidate who's moderate, a candidate who's not defined as somebody who excites the base of the Democratic Party. And they had that candidate, they thought, lined up to go for this gubernatorial race in 2018. Her name was Gwen Graham. She's the daughter of Bob Graham, who was the governor and senator from the state, moderate Democrat for years. She was a congresswoman herself. She got a bad deal in redistricting a couple of years ago, but she was a congresswoman from a conservative part of the state. I believe she won her seat in the House in 2014. She was the only, 2014, a bad midterm year for Democrats. I think she was the only Democrat to unseat a Republican incumbent in the House in 2014. So she fit that mold, that traditional mold of, hey, Democrats, let's be pragmatic. We got to win this state. It's a swing state. Let's go, to the middle. And she was running. She was expected to win that nomination. We all looked up on primary night. Huge surprise. No, Andrew Gillum is the Democratic nominee. And his message was not a message of pragmatic moderation and centrism. His message really turned on a Democratic base that was already very excited. And he was nominated. The other thing that we saw in Florida, though, in that primary that was unusual, that we weren't necessarily seeing elsewhere, is that the Republican base was just as excited. The turnout level on the Republican primary, the gubernatorial primary in Florida, you had sort of a similar choice for Republicans. You had a sort of a traditional, Adam Putnam was his name. He's a former congressman. He'd been the agriculture commissioner in Florida. Family goes back a long time in Florida. And that sort of traditional, you'd call him an establishment choice on the Republican side, somebody maybe you'd nominate with an eye to winning those moderate voters in Florida. And then you had DeSantis, who ran the ad where he's teaching his kids to build Trump's wall. Republican base wanted DeSantis. And the turnout in that Republican primary was also through the roof, also spoke to massive energy on the Republican side. And so what you really got in Florida, what made this race so interesting to me was each base was really energized and each base got exactly what it wanted. And it's happening in a swing state, a state we always look to every presidential election year. Now, what's Florida going to do? As Florida goes, maybe so goes the nation. We always think of it that way. May not always be true, but we think of it that way. So I thought we got a really interesting test potentially here for 2020, watching all of those dynamics come together. And the fascinating thing to me, watching these election results come in, in Florida, of course, most of the state, it's 7 o'clock Eastern, we get returns from everything but the panhandle. 8 o'clock, we start getting the panhandle. So, by 7:30, 7:45, 8 o'clock, we started to get a fair amount of result in from Florida. And I'm telling you, it was like watching 2016 all over again. In 2016, that was where you noticed that something unexpected was happening with Donald Trump. And some of these counties started coming in, particularly along the Gulf Coast, basically north of Tampa. You started seeing these counties come in 2016 where Trump you knew he was going to do well there, but he was doing a lot better than you thought he was going to do, and the turnout was a lot higher than you'd been expecting. And I remember seeing that in 2016. It's when the whole state of Florida turned around. It's when the whole presidential election kind of turned around. I also remember having the thought, when we noticed that in 2016, I said, the Gulf Coast north of Tampa, who are we talking about here? Talking about retirees from Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. And that was foreshadowing what came later in the night, those states that ended up making Donald Trump president. So it wasn't just a Gulf Coast story, it wasn't just a Florida story, that ended up being a national story. I saw something very similar in the results on election night 2018. We had seen early on numbers coming from those three blue counties that are around Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, the core Democratic counties of Florida. You saw numbers coming in there for Gillum early, and then you started to see those Gulf Coast counties come in, and you were seeing Trump-like margins, Trump-like energy. And you saw DeSantis get the lead, and Florida played out very similarly in 2018 to how it did in 2016. Same was true in the Senate race, obviously. although there were some extra issues with ballots in Broward County. But the broad patterns were very similar in 2018 and 2016. I think that's also why, if you're watching the coverage, whether it was any network you were watching, I think on election night 2018, this is what's happening at 8 p.m. This is what's happening at 8:30. People are watching what's happening in Florida and saying, is this 2016 all over again? Is this going to now be replicated elsewhere around the country? That's why that idea of a Democratic wave was such a slow thing, I think, to take hold. Not just on television. I think just was slow to take hold with everybody, because you were seeing something that seemed at odds with the Democratic wave. I think now, with a little bit more, distance here from Election Day, and with the complete picture that we've just gone through coming into focus, you start to see this story. There are patterns here in the returns in Florida that I think could be nationally significant in terms of 2020 and just in general. Part of it, I think, has to do with some of those Midwest states. We could talk more about them in a minute. But there's also, I think, some more Florida-specific. This result in 2018 reads to me a little bit less like an encapsulation of the country and more like there are some very Florida-specific aspects to this. This didn't signal a wave for Republicans. This didn't signal that the Democrats were going to fall short in the House or anything like that. It signaled to me, though, that Florida politics are intensely polarized, and the core Republican strength in Florida, I think, stronger than we realized. So now, look, Florida is a hugely important state in presidential elections. That's obviously a very good piece of news for Republicans heading into 2020. If they can look at Florida in what is, the midterm year is supposed to be the weak year for the coalition of the president's party, if they can still hang on to Florida in a midterm year after winning it in 2016, that's a very encouraging sign for them. The question is, how nationally significant is that? Which brings us to Ohio, which I think is the other state that Republicans got the best news of election night for them in. This is the governor's race in Ohio. This is Mike DeWine, who's the Attorney General, former U.S. Senator, been in Ohio politics forever. Richard Cordray, Elizabeth Warren's ally, nationally prominent Democrat. I think a surprise result, I think it's fair to say. I think the expectation, you even talked to Republicans about this before Election Day, the expectation was that Cordray was going to win this race. And again, the reason, when you start looking closely at these counties, you start looking at the regions of Ohio, the types of voters, it does speak to something you saw in Florida, something we clearly saw in this governor's race in Ohio, and something we saw in patches around the Midwest, around the Rust Belt, whatever you want to call it, the Trump country, where that surge strength that Donald Trump got in 2016 in rural areas, exurban areas, and also immediately around these small, older cities in the Midwest, places like Youngstown, places like Akron, rings sort of around those cities. Those areas, those voters were a lot more loyal, I think, to Republicans, to Trump's Republican Party in 2018 than maybe expected. And I think it's a reason why, for instance, in the governor's race in Ohio, you got this surprise victory for DeWine. Columbus, which is it's the biggest city in Ohio, but it's sort of suburban in nature. Columbus itself is almost a suburban city, and suburban areas, higher income suburban areas right around it. It's sort of the economic engine of Ohio. You've got a high concentration of white collar professionals. There are these types of voters we're talking about who Democrats are attracting nationally, Republicans are struggling with. You got that dynamic right outside Columbus, in the Columbus area, but you didn't get it in the rest of the state. Instead, you got the flip side of it in the rest of the state. You got sort of Trump country asserting itself and asserting a bit of a hold on Ohio, I think, 2 years later. Even in the Senate race in Ohio, Sherrod Brown, the Democrat, was reelected. His margin was 6 points. He was running against a Republican who was kind of abandoned. Jim Renacci was his name, was kind of abandoned by the National Party. You go north, I don't have it on here, you go north to Michigan, Senate race up there. Remember, Trump won Michigan, one of those key 3 states that made him president in 2016. Again, Democrats won the Senate race in Michigan. They also won the governorship in Michigan. Debbie Stabenow, the Democratic senator, was reelected in Michigan. But her Republican opponent was sort of a similar story, had kind of been written off. And I think what her 6-point victory there, Stabenow's in Michigan, kind of told you was in the same way that These Democratic voters in the suburbs in places like New Jersey are willing to overlook whatever just to be against Trump's party, Trump's party, Trumpism. I think there are more voters in sort of rural America, particularly in the Midwest. We saw this in Florida too. We see this in other places, who are voting party now, much more than they're voting candidate, much more than they're voting individual issues and races. This whole idea of the term used to be polarization, but really it's becoming tribalism. The cliche in politics used to be, it was Tip O'Neill, remember the Speaker of the House, all politics is local. Increasingly, I think it's no politics is local. People are making judgments based on what they see nationally, and these patterns are sort of asserting themselves in different regions of the country, demographically similar voters in different regions of the country behaving in very similar ways. I think that's one of the things I'm seeing in 2018. Put it this way, this stat is out there the other day. If you look at those House races, Democrats get 40 seats in the House. Democrats get almost all of those suburban Clinton districts that Republicans had hung on to in 2016. Not a single House district in the country where Trump won 55% or more of the vote in 2016 went to the Democrats in 2018. So they picked off almost everything they could short of that. And it amounts to a decisive gain. It amounts to control of the House. It amounts to a commanding victory in the national House popular vote. It amounts to a map of the country that if you just look at the midterm map and say, well, hey, if all of these contours were replicated in 2020, who would win? The answer obviously is Democrats. But when I say there's a part of me that looks at these results and wonders if you put Trump back on the ballot in 2020, you put an actual named Democratic opponent next to him, you have a year of the type of political combat that we have now playing out in the sort of media cultural atmosphere that we have right now with Trump calling the Democrat every name in the book, each side kind of reacting to the other. There are some signs in these results that make me wonder if the divisions that we saw in that map in 2016 don't just reassert themselves in 2020. So in terms of what 2018 means for 2020, my short answer is I don't know. But I would add this though, and I should have led with this probably. The one thing, if the patterns do reassert themselves for 2020 from 2016, keep in mind how narrow the Trump margin was in 2016 and how specific the set of circumstances were that got him elected. 75,000 votes, give or take, across 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Got to win those states, a margin of 75,000 votes across those states. About 46% of the vote nationally, about 46% of the popular vote. You had third-party candidates there who were gobbling up some of it, but almost 3 million votes short of his opponent in the national popular vote. It's just a very efficient distribution of votes for Trump when it comes to winning electoral college support. And an opponent, I think the question that hangs over 2020 is, can Donald Trump do to his Democratic opponent in 2020 what he was able to do to Hillary Clinton in 2016? Which is to say, by election day 2016, I think the only person in the world who could have lost to Hillary Clinton was Donald Trump, and the only person in the world who could have lost to Donald Trump was Hillary Clinton. They were both that unpopular. And we say, well, Hillary Clinton's always had issues, always been polarizing, those sorts of things. Keep in mind, the reason Hillary Clinton was the nominee in 2016 was how popular she seemed in 2013 when she stepped down as Secretary of State, when Gallup put her personal favorable rating close to 70%, when Democrats, said, look at the name, look at the resume, Secretary of State, look at those polls. She made peace with Barack Obama, the Barack Obama wing, and that whole movement, remember it, Ready for Hillary, emerged in 2013 and 2014. You had dozens of Democratic elected officials, members of Congress, preemptively endorsing her. It had the effect of, every Democrat who might have had a thought of running in 2016, almost every one of them said, nah, there's just not going to be money, there's not going to be endorsement, I'm going to be getting in the way, it's going to be embarrassing, to the point that, she ends up with a 75-year-old socialist from Vermont who's not even a registered Democrat as her main opponent, and Lincoln Chafee. I mean, Martin O'Malley. I mean, that was the effect of the psychology of the Democratic Party about Hillary Clinton's electability in 2013 and 2014. They believed she was strong politically, and the polls in 2013 and 2014 seemed to back that up. She was certainly much more popular when you looked at Gallup polling in that period than Joe Biden. And yet it's funny, 3 years later or so, 4 years later, it's conventional wisdom to say, oh, the Democrats screwed up. If only they'd gone with Biden. They never would have lost Pennsylvania. They never would have lost Michigan. They never would have lost Wisconsin. Scranton Joe, come on, it was so obvious. What were they thinking? Well, what they were thinking was that the polls showed Hillary Clinton was substantially more popular than Joe Biden. Joe Biden had an upside-down popularity rating in Gallup's poll in 2014. He was known as the human gaffe machine. He couldn't open his mouth without sticking his foot in it. He said things to embarrass himself, to embarrass the administration, to get in the administration's way. At best, he was crazy Uncle Joe. At worst, he was a political liability. That was the image of Joe Biden in 2014, and that image also helped give rise to the Ready for Hillary movement. Joe Biden was just waiting for Barack Obama, his boss, the president, to say, Joe, you've been my guy for 8 years. Go out there and run. I'm with you. Obama never said it to him. Obama didn't think he was the most electable candidate. Obama thought Hillary was the smart choice for Democrats to make. So Biden didn't run. So no one besides Bernie Sanders, Lincoln Chafee, Jim Webb, I forgot. Jim Webb actually ran there for a while too. Almost nobody got in. And we all found out, obviously, it was more complicated than that. I bring all of that up only because I think that's the other big question as we start to look ahead to 2020. You can look at the potential candidates that the Democratic field is starting to come into focus now, believe it or not. You had Deval Patrick, the former governor of Massachusetts. He said today he's not running. So there you got your first, well, Michael Avenatti said he's not running. So we got our second casualty of the Democratic race. I saw, John Hickenlooper, the outgoing governor of Colorado. I think he said he's going to decide by the first week of January. They're starting to make their moves. It's starting to come into focus right now. But I think about that example of Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden a lot, and how 4 years ago at this time, Hillary Clinton seemed like the smart play and Joe Biden seemed like the dumb play. And now every smart person in politics will tell you, what a layup Biden would have been and what a suicidal decision it was to nominate Hillary Clinton. It just makes me think two things. It makes me think, number one, all right, I can see a lot of names on the Democratic side, and I could imagine them being strong opponents against Donald Trump, but we don't really know what it's going to look like once they're thrown into the mud with him, once he gives them a nickname, once their resume is gone over with a fine-tooth comb. I mean, who knows? It's the reality of our politics. There's the tribalism on top of it. There's all of it. How will they look? Hillary Clinton did not look on Election Day 2016 politically like she looked when she left as Secretary of State at all. Joe Biden, for that matter, looked different because nothing will enhance your image or your reputation in politics than sitting out a race and being the one who everybody gets to point to and say, if only they'd gone with so-and-so. That's the source of Joe Biden. I think that's the source of Joe Biden's strength. He didn't run, and instead of being attacked by Donald Trump, Trump still attacked him a little, but instead of being attacked by every other Republican for a year and a half of his life, instead of being attacked by conservative media every day for a year and a half, he had conservatives, he had Republicans using him as a tool, as a way of going after Hillary. These Democrats, man, if they put up Biden, we might be in trouble here, but thank God they went with Hillary, So I don't, we live in this atmosphere. The tribalism is a big part of it. The media atmosphere is a big part of it. Trump's peculiar nature of politics is a big part of it. And I think it's the open question here in 2020. If he can make any Democratic candidate look like Hillary Clinton did in 2016, if the combined force of Trump and the media, all these other things can do that, then I think you could go back to the exact kind of division you had there in 2016. But if there's an element of that really was Hillary specific, and really can be avoided by another Democrat, a piece of it, that margin 75,000 votes across 3 states, you know, all those pieces that were already in place for Democrats. It doesn't take a lot to flip that outcome around. And I think that's what 2018 kind of shows me. They, as we just said, they did not win a district, Democrats, where Trump had got more than 55% of the vote. You want to say low-hanging fruit, that might be minimizing it too much, but they went after, just by going after and succeeding in places like that, less than 55% of the vote, they were still able to get a 40-seat gain. There was enough there. So you don't need to take these giant strides in the way we used to think of them to turn around what happened in 2016 if you're a Democrat. Very, very relatively small shift will do it for you. So I think there are long-term trends that are hardening here in terms of Republican support in rural areas, Republican support in ex-urban areas, Republican support with blue-collar, non-college whites, with states like Ohio moving further toward the Republican column, with a state like Florida tilting a little bit more to the Republican side than we thought. I think these are all long-term things. Some of them were predating Trump but have been dramatically accelerated by Trump. And I think that's countered by, again, this incredibly growing Democratic strength in metropolitan America, if you want to call it that. It's taken, in my lifetime, a state like New Jersey. George H.W. Bush's name is in the news. So in 1988, George H.W. Bush won New Jersey in a landslide when he ran against Michael Dukakis. The suburbanites were all, they called them yuppies back then. They drove Volvos and they voted Republican, and they voted for George H.W. Bush. And in 1992, Bill Clinton carried it, but barely. He carried the state by 2 points in 1992. By 1996, Clinton had it up to a double-digit advantage for the Democrats in New Jersey, and now you get, again, to the Menendez. To me, Menendez is the ultimate example of it. But Menendez able to basically win by double digits with everything that he was up against in 2018. That is how blue a state like New Jersey's come. So those types of states, and then looking, if you're a Democrat, looking at a Georgia, looking at a Texas, looking at an Arizona, a couple other opportunities on the map. I think those are the trade-offs that are kind of emerging. Republicans maybe solidifying Ohio, but do they solidify Ohio at the cost of Georgia? That might be one question. Those two things may not happen in the exact same space of time, but I think that's sort of the longer-term trend we're moving toward here. So, with that in mind, maybe I always enjoy doing questions, comments, answers, all that. Why don't we open it up?
Okay, so thank you.
First of all, Mr. Kornacki, thanks for being here and thanks for your work. You and vodka are the only way I get through election results. And you're great, I say that with respect, but the vodka helps. My question is, going back to Florida, what do you think the impact will be of the recent amendment restoring voting rights?
Right, for convicted felons, there's been a lot of, so there's a couple of, this was Florida simultaneously with the election in 2018. There was a ballot referendum to restore voting rights for convicted felons. That's a substantial number of people who now will be, and it passed, who will now be eligible to be added to the rolls in Florida. There's talk that this could produce a long-term boost for Democrats. There are obviously assumptions built in that we are talking about Democratic voters here. I think it might be a little more complicated than that. My main point of caution on it, though, is I feel versions of this in Florida and elsewhere through the years where the equation is going to be changed because we're adding this group to the mix, or the size of this group is growing. Remember what it was supposed to be in Florida this year? Anybody remember? Puerto Rican voters. You had a hurricane in Puerto Rico. The island was devastated. They are already American citizens. They can vote in American elections, and they are moving to the mainland because the island of Puerto Rico was devastated, and by God, do they hate Donald Trump and the Republican Party, and well, look how narrow Trump's margin was in Florida in 2016, so there goes 2018 for the Democrats, or for the Republicans in Florida. Didn't happen. Couple of things. First of all, the governor of Florida, Rick Scott, who just got elected to the Senate, made outreach to Puerto Rican voters a priority. He visited Puerto Rico multiple times. I think did better with the Puerto Rican vote than was expected. I think that's one of the lessons of Florida. If you add a new constituency or you dramatically expand constituency, politicians will start paying more attention to it. And politicians might start reaping more of a reward from it. And that constituency may not vote quite the way folks are expecting it will vote. There's also a secondary part of it was, if you looked at, and I don't actually have the board, so I would go into Florida and I would touch the button and I would show you the particular counties in Florida around Orlando, basically, where this was supposed to be particularly pronounced for Democrats. You didn't see that. You saw actually lower turnout and stronger Republican support overall. So it's my cautionary note I wish I could think of a couple more examples, but I feel I've seen this, heard this a lot through the years. It's almost, you almost would call it demographic triumphalism. And it's often a lot more complicated than it looks on paper. Why don't we go with you?
Steve, could you elaborate a little bit on the impact of, or non-impact of the Hispanic vote?
Yeah, so actually, I can go back. Next one. Okay, so actually, a number of these, let's say on the impact of the Hispanic vote, I guess there's two things I would say on this. First of all, it's Hispanic voters, Latino voters is a very broad umbrella. And I don't think it's always appreciated how broad that umbrella is. On the subject of Florida, again, the Republican level of support, Rick Scott's level of support, Ron DeSantis' level of support with Hispanic voters in Florida was well into the 30s, the high 30s. One of the reasons for that is one of the groups that falls under the Hispanic umbrella in Florida is the Cuban American vote. And the Cuban vote is not as Republican as it used to be, but it's still a lot more friendly to Republicans than other Hispanic voter groups in different parts of the country. In Texas, where obviously you have a large Hispanic population there, more Mexican origin, you have a Republican Party. We talk about this idea of political parties responding to changing demographics. The Republican Party in Texas has tried for decades now. George W. Bush was a prime example of this, to reach out to Hispanic voters in Texas. Republicans don't win the Hispanic vote in Texas, but they do better in Texas with it than you see elsewhere. Ted Cruz was able to get 35% of the Hispanic vote in Texas. Remember, in 2016, Donald Trump nationally, if you want a benchmark, he got 29% of the Hispanic vote. Mitt Romney in 2012 nationally got 27% of the Hispanic vote. Ted Cruz was at 35% in Texas in 2018. Not a great Republican year. He was able to survive in his Senate seat by 3 points. So it's a broader category. There's also a growing, you start to see this more in polling now. We talk about a gender gap. We're starting to see a gender gap among Latino voters too. Starting to see Latino men be significantly more friendly to their, again, not saying Republicans are winning them, but more friendly, more open to, I should say, voting Republican than women. So you're starting to see a gender gap there too. You're seeing some partisan diversity there that I think we have a tendency to talk about the Hispanic vote as this monolithic block that's Democratic, and the only question is, how Democratic is it going to be? Really Democratic or really, really Democratic? And I think there's, Florida and Texas are prime examples of where that wasn't the case. That said, California, I think, is a bit of a different story. California is a state where the Hispanic vote has been a lot more hostile to the Republican Party. And some of these districts, you just see on your screen right here, the 25th district, the 10th district, that was Jeff Denham. The 21st district that was just called tonight. These are districts with large Latino populations in them, where either the Republicans have done well in the past, well enough with those voters to win, or, this was especially true in the 21st district, the turnout level among Latino voters in particular had been extremely low in the past. And you would look at a congressional election in the 21st District of California, and the overall turnout number, it would just be microscopic compared to other congressional districts. It grew in 2018. And you got a list here. There are 7 California districts, Clinton Republican California districts on this list. They all flipped to the Democrats, and Latino voters are absolutely a part of that shift in California. Again, right there with these sort of white college-educated suburbanites, particularly women. I mean, it's a gender gap too. Particularly women in the suburbs. That's a major part of the 2018 story in terms of not just what happened in November 2018, but in terms of what was happening in the primaries, in terms of which candidates were nominated, in terms of where money came from, small dollar donations, that sort of thing. But yeah, I think California, if you want to look at those congressional districts in California, I think that's where I would say you saw the impact the most, sort of acutely. I see one back in the back there.
Number one, what message do you think plays better in 2020 for the Democrats? We've seen progressivism move to the left. Does that message resonate better with the electorate going into 2020, or do the Democrats nominate someone that's going to play towards the middle? And then the second question for the Republican side is, if the president's numbers stay lukewarm, do the Republicans freak out or have a meltdown, and do they look to someone that potentially challenges them? On the right, what does the country and the math look like there?
Yeah. So on the Democratic side, I guess where my head, it's the classic question of strategy, and it's, and we were just talking about it with Florida. Do you go to the middle, or do you go for a more, ideological message? And I guess one of the things that I'm asking myself, one of the things I'm wondering, and I'm leaning towards, I think this is where I kind of land, is the ideology. The ideological component is secondary to the personality, not just the personality, but the Beto O'Rourke, I think, is guy next to you has a Beto shirt on. Oh, perfect example. Okay, so look at this. We're in the middle of New Jersey. Somebody's got a Beto shirt. I mean, I don't think there were a lot of candidates around the country who were running on a platform that looked like Beto O'Rourke's, where if you just put the platform on this side of the page and you put the other candidate's platform on that side of the page, and you say, which one is Beto O'Rourke, and which one is Bob Casey in Pennsylvania. I don't know that there were a lot of issues you wouldn't have been able to tell them apart. What set Beto O'Rourke apart was there was something about Beto O'Rourke that resonated, that captured energy, that galvanized people. And I think there was a reaction to that reaction too. I think that's always a part of politics. These things don't happen in vacuums. There's a reaction to the reaction, there's a reaction to the reaction to the reaction, and on we go. But I think of it more. I think of it more in those terms for Democrats. Do you want a candidate? Beto O'Rourke could run for president. There's an example. Do you want a candidate who generates that kind of energy with what he represents personally, what his story represents, what his personality represents, her personality represents, her story represents? Do you want a candidate like that, and everything that could come with that, which could be higher turnout, which could be higher energy, all those sorts of things, but there also could be a reaction to it? Or do you want a candidate who is kind of what Trump would call low energy vehicle and to try to make the election simply, look, if you don't want Trump as president, we got this person, they're boring as heck, they're not going to screw anything up, you just want to, I almost think that's it's not necessarily, to me, I don't find myself looking at this election and saying it's this issue, or I know there's a lot of talk about health care, but I think that was to me a much more basic political lesson for Republicans, which parties have been relearning for decades now. But I don't think it's so much about the issue set as it is, to me, that question. In terms of the Republican side, and is Trump going to get a challenge? Look, he might get a challenge. I think there's in the culture we live in right now, there's an incentive for some Republican. You'll get attention. There will be donors who get behind you. There will be a media that's very eager for the story. You will get attention. You'll get notice. I think there are states, there are places at least on the map where a Republican challenger to Trump could do surprisingly well. I think New Hampshire might even be one of them. I think just the nature of New Hampshire, I could see somebody like John Kasich going into New Hampshire and doing surprisingly well. Remember, Pat Buchanan against George Bush Sr. in '92 did surprisingly well. Obviously, Buchanan and Kasich are very different, but I could see a surprise in a state like New Hampshire. Could I see a Republican getting in and knocking off Trump for the nomination? I couldn't see that right now. I couldn't see anything close to that right now for two reasons. Number one, just his approval rating with Republicans continues, even after this, to be about 80% plus. He is on par with where Reagan was, where George W. Bush was. These are Republican presidents who did not inspire primary challenges. The other thing is, if you remember back to the 2016 primaries, it always struck me that, remember, there was always the anti-Trump folks in the Republican Party, always, it started in the summer of 2015. Trump jumped to 15% in a poll. And they, oh, don't worry, that means 85% of the party will never vote for him. Then he's at 20%. I meant to say 80. Then he's at 25, 75, that's there, 75%. Hardcore anti, keep going on and on and on, until more than 50%, in some of these states were voting for him, outright majorities. And Trump's growth, when you started looking at it, you realize the nature of his candidacy in 2016, the nature of his appeal in the Republican Party, it was not factional. It was not just evangelical conservatives. It was not, another factional candidate would be just if somebody ran as like a pro-choice Republican and there were just, to the extent you still have moderate liberal Republicans, just moderate liberal Republicans. You looked exit poll after exit poll, it was spread out. He would win the self-described moderates in exit polls, and he'd win the evangelicals. Now, he might get, 32% here, 37% here in these competitive primaries. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was spread out. And that's why it never made sense to me in 2016 when it was like, okay, you got Ted Cruz and John Kasich both going after Donald Trump. Remember, it came down to that. And everybody was saying, well, why don't, Cruz and Kasich just team up? They'll take out Trump. I said, show me the overlap between what they represent, because Trump is tapping into a lot of what Kasich taps into, and he's tapping into a lot of what Cruz taps into. If you just look at the exit poll, so you get rid of Cruz, a lot of those votes are just going to go to Trump. You get rid of Kasich, a lot of them are just going to go to Trump, and that's what happened. So I think that the nature of his coalition in the Republican Party, it's not that ideological. It's broad within the Republican Party. It's not factional, and I think it makes it very difficult to come up with a strategy that could defeat him. So I suspect, barring something that we haven't seen yet, and we've seen a lot, but we may not have seen everything, I suspect he'll be the nominee if he wants to be the nominee in 2020. Let me go over to this side of the room.
Thank you, Steve. As a follow-up, how bad would the Robert Mueller report have to be before the 85% comes down to a more manageable level, would you say?
Yeah. So when I say we haven't seen maybe everything yet, that's what's on my mind. It's the wild card. I wish I had an answer where I could say he has to find this, or this. I don't know where that line is, and I found myself a few times over the last couple years thinking, whether it was Mueller related or not. Sometimes it was other matters like the press conference with Putin a couple months ago, thinking we were approaching a line where we were going to start seeing types of defections on the Republican side that we hadn't seen before. And it felt to me a number of times we've walked up to that point and we've kind of then just crossed the line and then nothing happened and everybody's like, well, never mind, that wasn't really a line. And so I pardon me, I'm open to the possibility. And but I don't know exactly. I just, other than just the obvious, it has to be severe, it has to be specific, it has to be, the cliche of the smoking gun. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but it's just, it's hard to take stock of every rule of politics we thought existed. That you can't do this and be elected president or survive. You can't say that. so many of those have been obliterated at this point. Things we thought were true, and I guess were never tested necessarily, we're finding out weren't true. And so we may learn many more of those things between now and whenever the end point of this drama is. Why don't we go right here?
Hi. My particular interest is money in politics, and you mentioned the effect of the small dollar donations, which was a huge story that really got very little attention by the mainstream media, to the point where, I know, was it $5.2 billion is the estimate of what was spent on this midterm election. I saw some small articles here and there where some of the small dollar donations on so many of these races was actually really pushing the Republican donors to the point where they couldn't cover all these various races. So I would like to hear what else you have to say about that.
Yeah, yes, especially in these, go back to the flip list there, especially, I mean, the core battleground in the House, you had Republicans in some of these districts just getting swamped when it came to money. And the reason was you had, at the sort of elite level, the big dollar donors, the folks who traditionally fuel politics financially, Republicans were holding their own there. They were getting about what they wanted, more or less. But you had this, sort of grassroots engagement on the blue side at a level you just hadn't had before. And I mean, Beto O'Rourke is the sort of the ultimate individual example of he whatever that energy is that he tapped into. You look up in the middle of September, and he's got $40 million for a Senate race in Texas, and that's coming heavily from folks on their iPhone at their computer seeing a clip of him or watching a news story about him or whatever, and just boom, $50. And that being replicated over and over and over again. And I know it frustrated Republicans after the election when they looked at that imbalance, that sort of small dollar, internet-driven imbalance that pushed record sums of money to Democrats and where Republicans just weren't getting it. And you have some Republican leaders saying, okay, we got to, what was the website Democrats had? Let's get that. What was the platform Democrats had? Let's get that. I said, what Democrats had was Trump. The Trump presidency has energized the Democratic base in a way. They will find the platform. They will find the specific internet tool, but they're looking for it. And Republicans couldn't match that. And I do look, some of these races were very close. And you say, what tipped the scale of Democrats in some of them? I mean, I think money's not necessarily worth what it used to be in politics anymore. People are so conditioned for the negative ads. People fast forward through them on their whatever. But it can still play a role. And when there's a big imbalance, it can move, I think, a couple points. In some of these races, it might have been the money.
We've got time for one last.
All right.
One last.
I saw your hand go first. I'll go to you.
Getting back to the 2018 House races here, specifically the flipped races, can you address the changes in voter registration between 2014 and 2018 by party?
I mean, it depends where you're looking, but broadly speaking, you just saw in states that do voter registration by party, because not every state does, you saw a trend in the Democrats' favor. Which, I mean, it tracks with everything we've been seeing about where the energy was, where the grassroots energy was. I think party registration is another measure when we describe small dollar donations coming in, when we describe imbalances in terms of turnout in primaries, huge turnout in the Democratic primary, not nearly as big turnout in the Republican primary. When you saw these special elections that we had throughout 2017 and 2018, special elections for Congress, for Georgia 6 we talked about, Pennsylvania had that, the 18th district of Pennsylvania, even just state legislative races around the country where you'd never know the candidates unless you lived in the district. You were just seeing pretty consistently an energy imbalance there on the Democratic side, where there was just much more energy for Democrats than Republicans. And I think party registration is it's something that tracks with that. It's one of those indicators you can look at that often you see a big result coming for the party benefiting from that in the run-up to the election.
On that note, I want to thank Steve Kornacki.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ben. Sure, yeah. Excellent.
Thank you all for coming out for tonight. Thank you to Steve Kornacki. If I can ask you, just hold your seats for a moment. We're going to escort Steve back into the lobby so he can sign books, but we'll never get there if he has to stop every 3 feet because somebody wants a selfie, right? So we're going to just let us get him there. By all means, pick up another copy of the book so that, you know, Steve makes a living. And everyone else, please have a wonderful holiday season and a safe trip home. Thank you for coming out. We look forward to seeing you at our next event.